Is there a difference between how you explain other people's behavior compared to your own? Like, do you ever notice how if you're speeding in your car, it's because you cannot be late, but when someone else is doing so, they're a maniac? Social psychology is, in essence, the study of the power of situational forces, how circumstances can often change our behavior, but we don't always look at others that way. And so today, we are going to take a look at attribution and attitude, helping us to understand how we explain other people's behavior and mental processes and how we do that for ourselves and how the situation plays a role. So let's first start by talking about what attribution is. Because attribution is our explanation for ourselves and for others' behavior. And we can either make a dispositional attribution, explaining behavior from traits and abilities, like in the example of someone speeding, calling them a maniac, or we can explain behavior using situational attributions, looking at the situation like running late to work or having some kind of an emergency that would also elicit the same behavior. When looking at events, we can also make what are known as explanatory styles. We can explain events from either optimistic or pessimistic explanatory styles. Optimistic and pessimistic attributional styles are going to depend on the situation themselves. If we're successful, an optimistic explanatory style might explain that from an internal and global perspective. I was successful because I am great and I am great at everything. Whereas a failure might be explained as external and specific. I failed because of the noisy construction outside, and next time it won't be there, so I will do better. Whereas a pessimistic explanatory style is going to take on the opposite effect. With success, someone with a pessimistic explanatory style is going to explain that outcome due to something unstable and specific, like this was a lucky chance and it's not going to happen again. Whereas that failure is going to be explained as being global and being internal. I failed because I am a failure and I always will be a failure. Now, in these cases of dispositional or situational attributional styles and explanatory styles, what we're really getting into here is the fact that we have bias. That when we go to explain our behavior or others' behavior, we might be doing so without really considering the full picture. The actor-observer bias, for example, is the tendency to explain our own behavior from those situational forces and explaining other people's behavior using those dispositional forces. Going along with that is the fundamental attribution error. We overestimate to the extent that those dispositional factors play a role in someone's behavior and underestimate the situational factors. We're more likely to do that for others than we are for ourselves because we don't know the other person's situation. And so our tendency is to go straight for their disposition. And we can also have a bias for ourselves when explaining outcomes by using a self-serving bias, where we always make ourselves look good. So if someone running for mayor loses the election, for example, they might say it's because of an unfair campaign by their opponent or because the election was rigged. But if they won the election, they would say it's because they're the best candidate and they deserve to win. In either situation, they're trying to make themselves look good. We also have to consider where we place control in our lives and whether or not we think we have the control to make changes. If you have an external locus of control, that is when someone believes that their outcomes are determined by luck or fate, that they are not in control of the outcomes that happen to them. Whereas internal locus of control means they believe that they do have control, that they are responsible for their outcomes. Different locus of control are going to be thoughts or beliefs, not necessarily what's actually happening, but they can influence somebody's behavior based on the situation. And there are a lot of different ways that our thoughts are then going to impact our behavior in social psychology. The mere exposure effect, for example, influences things like people's purchasing behaviors. Because we see things more often, we might view them more favorably, and that might change our behavior as a result. For example, if you're buying cookies at the store, you might be more likely to buy the name brand ones that you've seen many times over, even if the ingredients are the exact same for the generic kind, Mere exposure effect has led us to view that one that we see more often more favorably. Or a self-fulfilling prophecy. Our beliefs about what we think are going to happen may unconsciously bring that about. For example, people who perceive the world as friendly are more likely to smile at others. They get more smiles back as a result, therefore reinforcing their belief that the world is friendly. And people who believe that they are unlucky are less likely to play games of chance. Because they don't play, they're not winning, and it's reinforcing their belief that they are, in fact, unlucky. Not only how we think about ourselves, but how we think about others can also impact our behavior. For example, with social comparison, we can either do what's known as upwards or downwards social comparison, where we compare ourselves to others that seem to have more than we do, or comparing ourselves to those that seem to have less than we do. Upward social comparison can be useful if it helps us to set goals for ourselves. And downward social comparison can help us put things into perspective or even increase our self-esteem by helping us to realize how good we have it. However, our natural tendency is often to engage in that upward comparison due to relative deprivation. Our mind's tendency to think that we are worse off than we actually are. So when we are looking around the world and comparing ourselves to others, our tendency is to look to people who have more and believe that as a result, we are deprived in some way. And all of this is to say that when we're looking around the world and looking at others, it's going to impact the way that we think about them, like stereotypes and implicit attitudes that we have about groups. Because stereotypes are usually going to be negative and they're going to be generalized. And the reason why we do this so often and so easily is because of our cognitive load. It's the amount of effort required to process information. Quite frankly, we as humans like to think as quickly and as easily as possible. And so making stereotypes or generalizations about groups helps to lessen the cognitive load of thinking critically in different situations. Unfortunately, this can lead to things like prejudice, the unjustifiable attitude that we have towards groups, or discrimination when someone actually acts on that group or its members. These can often come from what are known as implicit attitudes. They're automatic, they're involuntary, and they're unconscious. The reason why they happen could be for a wide variety of reasons, both from social and cognitive factors. Social factors, like the just world phenomenon, for example, might be that we believe that people tend to get what they deserve. So when we see somebody, let's say, being pulled over, we might believe that they deserve that in some way, that they must have been doing something wrong to elicit that response. Because we also organize the world based on grouping principles, as we learned in Gestalt psychology, we might also start to develop in-group and out-group biases. The out-group homogeneity bias is the tendency to view individuals in out-groups as more similar to each other than they actually are. That just because they are not a part of a group, that they are then all alike. That can then, of course, lead to that generalizing, that can lead to stereotypes. An in-group bias is a tendency to favor people who are members of our own group over other groups. So whether they are members of our own school, community, culture, and so on, we tend to view those groups more favorably. In broader terms, that can lead to things like ethnocentrism, where we believe that our own culture or ethnic group is superior to others. And that, of course, can be inaccurate. The creation and development of these implicit attitudes can also be reinforced by bias that we have. And we, of course, are all going to have bias in one way or another. Sometimes that bias is going to come in the form of belief perseverance, where once we have a belief that is formed, even when we're faced with contrary evidence or evidence proving that we are incorrect, we might still hold on to that belief that we had. Or confirmation bias, where we seek out information to prove that we are in fact correct, as opposed to really looking at both sides and trying to find information that is most accurate. And when we are faced with our attitudes and behaviors not being lined up, we are being faced with what's known as cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is the discomfort that we might feel, and so we either have to change our attitude or change our behavior in order to reconcile that. So next time you watch someone else's behavior, ask yourself, how are you explaining it? Are you carefully considering the situational forces that may be playing a role? Or are you making some kind of fundamental attribution error or using some other bias in your decision-making process? It happens more often than we think, but the more we can identify it, the more we can combat it. So thank you so much for watching, and as always, remember, be kind to your mind.